I'm going to preach it. I'm going to preach. All right, you can, we're going to, it's be a little while till we get there, but we're going to get to 1 John chapter 3. So it's 1 John 3:16. Instead of John 3:16, that's going to be our starting place.
Where are we starting?
1 John 3:16.
Oh, I'm sorry. I misunderstood.
And we've been looking at the topic, Christ loved the church, do we? And tonight, instead of looking at a specific one another, we're going to focus on the fact, and it ties in with our Sunday school actually, that Christ is building his church. And he loved the church. And so if we love him, we ought to be building the church as well. We should love what it is that he loves. And so I'd like to start with this little illustration. If you've had children or have worked with children, sometimes you know that when they have blocks, one child might build a little tower, and the other child does what? Comes and knocks it down. That's right. And then they build it again, and he knocks it down again, and then the kids fight, and then they cry, and it's a mess. Yeah, well, that's right. It's called sinners, being sinners. But I thought that really, I mean in a maybe over-exaggerated sense, but that's what can happen in the church. You know, Jesus is building the church, and we come along and we can knock it down and mess it up. And so we should focus on building the church instead of knocking the church down. And so as we think about his building the church, we're going to review just a couple things. Well, actually, we're going to consider 2 points over the next couple of weeks. Number one, what is involved in building the church? When we say Christ is building the church, how is it that we are building the church? And secondly, how can I be involved in building the church? What are specific things that I can do? And so what's involved? And there are basically 2 things. One we're going to consider tonight. What's involved in building the church? Sacrifice. Now, how do I know that? Because that's how the church started, the sacrifice of Christ. So put your Sunday school review helmet on instead of your thinking caps. And we started with Matthew 16. We spent some time talking about the fact that he was going to build his church. And at that point in time, where was he headed? When he was in the upper room with the disciples and he said, I will build my church, where was he going?
To 70 and then the cross.
To the cross, that's right. So he was heading to the cross. And then Peter, who had just made such a great confession of faith, and upon that confession I'll build my church, then he said, I'm going to go be crucified. He didn't say it in those words, but that's basically what he said. Do you remember what Peter said then in response to that?
Not you, Lord. Not you.
Right. I'm not going to let it happen. Okay. Now that's really an important thing as we think about building the church. Because after he made that statement, do you remember how Jesus responded to him? Get thee behind me, Satan. That's pretty strong language. So from the sublime, you are the Christ, to get thee behind me, Satan. Now, I don't believe that means that by any token that Peter was demon-possessed. Because he goes on to explain that you're talking about not the things of God. You're not savoring the things of God. That was God's will for Jesus to go to the cross. That's how the church was going to be built. And Satan was trying to stand in the way of that happening. There's a very fascinating idea involved with that that statement and that response is because when they were in the upper room, or even before that, well, I guess in the upper room, that Satan, it says Satan filled Judas's heart, and then he went out to betray Jesus. Now, Satan did not want Jesus to go to the cross. But the ironic thing is that Satan knew very well Genesis 3:15. That's where it says the seed of the woman will crush the serpent's head. And Satan can read the Bible. You know, he knows what the prophecies were and so forth. And so he wanted to do everything he could to keep Jesus from going to the cross. I mean, he did everything he could so the nation would be destroyed before Jesus was born. And then when Jesus was born, he tried to have him killed. And then he came to the temptation, tried to get Jesus to worship him. So he's doing everything he could to keep Jesus from the cross, because that would be his swan song. Satan's, that is. So if that's the case, then why did he compel Judas to betray Christ so that he would be killed? You see, that seems almost like a contradiction. But here's the thing, and I wasn't here, but it may be something that John Ludlow brought out in the Sunday school message the week I was gone. But Satan wanted Jesus killed, but not on the cross, because the cross was the means of his death. So many times throughout the earthly life of Christ, it says the Jews picked up stones to stone him. So when Judas betrayed Jesus, he betrayed him to the Jewish leaders. But God obviously thwarted Satan's plan, but he wanted the Jews to try him and stone him, and that's what Satan wanted. So when Peter said, "No, I'm not going to let you go to the cross," whose mindset was he mimicking? You see, that's the point. So it wasn't that he was demon-possessed, "Get thee behind me, Satan," but it was Satan was using Peter to try to discourage Christ from the cross. That was the main idea there. But he had to go to the cross because he's going to build his church, and it's going to be built upon his death, burial, and resurrection. So now we're at 1 John chapter 3, verse 16. I mentioned the other day the famous 3:16s of the Bible. Here's another one. 1 John 3:16, "By this we know love, because he laid down his life for us. We also ought to lay down our lives for the brethren." Now, their sacrifice. Now, what does that look like? Does it mean each of us needs to run out and be crucified? No, we can't be crucified to save a soul. Only the sacrifice of Christ could do that. But we can sacrifice ourselves for the well-being of the brethren in order to build the church. Turn to Philippians chapter 2. Philippians chapter 2. And verse 30. Epaphroditus was a helper of Paul, whom Paul was sending back to the Philippians and so forth. And Epaphroditus was concerned because the Philippians heard that he was not well. And he didn't want them to be sorrowing that he wasn't well, and he got better. And so they wanted the message communicated that he's doing better. But notice it says in verse 25, "Yet I considered it necessary to send to you Epaphroditus, my brother, fellow worker, and fellow soldier, but your messenger and the one who ministered to my need, since he was longing for you all and was distressed, because you had heard that he was sick. For indeed he was sick, almost unto death. But God had mercy on him, and not only on him, but on me also, lest I should have sorrow upon sorrow." I mean, he was a helper of Paul, and that would have been a big loss for Paul. "Therefore, I sent him the more eagerly, that when you see him again you may rejoice, and I may be less sorrowful. Receive him therefore in the Lord with all gladness, and hold such men in esteem. Now look at verse 30. It says, because for the work of Christ he came close to death, not regarding his life, to supply what was lacking in your service toward me. That's sacrificial, see. Paul was communicating the gospel, building the church, establishing local churches. Here's a man who laid down his life for the brethren. He worked even to the point of exhaustion, if you will, and the Lord spared him. And so when we talk about building the church began by the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ, and the church began to be built. It was a sacrifice in order that the church could start and be built. And then throughout the ages, there are individuals who sacrifice their lives doing the work in order that the church might be built. And so that's the admonition to us. Christ is building his church, or we. I'm not saying that we have to run ourselves ragged to the point of exhaustion and point of illness and death, but I think we all need to, and I'm probably preaching to the choir here, we all need to think about the fact that there are a lot of things we can do in life and with our lives, but are we giving and sacrificing the time so that the church can be built? Because that's what God is doing, that's what Christ is doing, and that's how we can show our love for him when we sacrificially involve ourselves so the church can be built.